Hey guys, I just wanted to throw my hat into the ring and make a brief response video to Suan Sonna's nearly comprehensive video presentation to Gavin on icon veneration. To catch everyone up to speed, the debate here between Gavin and Suan is over what the implications Nicea II has for Roman Catholicism. Basically, either Nicea II claims that icon veneration as such goes all the way back to the apostles, or it allows for development. Now, if the council claims the practice goes all the way back to the apostles, this would be problematic for the Catholic because development is the only plausible route they can take. Both Suan and Gavin agree with everything as stated. So here's where they differ. Gavin argues that Nicea II does not allow for development. This is because, he argues, the council itself claims that icon veneration goes back to the apostles. And if the practice goes all the way back, then what is there to develop? It's always been there. Suan argues that no, Nicea II does allow for development. Indeed, development is implied by the council. This is because they are only saying that the theology that supports icon veneration goes back to the apostles, not so much the practice itself, or at least not the 8th century version of the practice. And so what Suan argues is that the council is making a case for development. Indeed, it implies development. So in this video, I want to focus on Suan's arguments here. In particular, the arguments he makes in part 1 of his presentation, namely that Nicea II does allow for development. And I want to do this mostly by appealing to the author of the book that Suan cites from in the video, Roman Catholic scholar Father Richard Price. I ordered the book last week in the interest of looking into this topic myself. A few words about Price. He's an eminent scholar and professor of the history of Christianity out of Haythrop College in London. In this particular work, he has translated the entire Council of Nicea II, including all of its sessions. And I have the understanding that he is the first to do this in over 150 years. Not only this, but he's translated and written commentaries on various other church councils from antiquity as well. So he's probably one of the foremost experts on this topic, and he's been doing this for a long time. So this is an incredible book, and his commentary here is especially helpful. So I want to begin with a quick observation and comment. Throughout Suan's video, it is mentioned that he is arguing against Gavin's reading of Nicea II. But in reality, after looking through the book, Gavin's reading is really in fact Richard Price's reading. Yes, Richard Price, who is Roman Catholic, is the one arguing in his book that Nicea II claims that icon veneration goes back to the apostles. I think this clarification helps because this is not simply Gavin as Protestant apologist making this argument. It's what the very author of the book says as well. So I just wanted to put that out there. So Suan offers several reasons for why he thinks Nicea II allows for icon veneration, and they are as follows. 1. First, there is this sort of broad claim by Suan that Nicea II is not claiming that icon veneration goes back to the apostles. There are qualifications to this, which I will address later. 2. Suan claims that the sessions of the council do not make explicit mention of the apostles engaging in 8th century style icon veneration, and the word veneration is left open by the council. 3. Suan claims that the decree of the council does not explicitly say that the apostles practiced icon veneration. 4. Suan claims that because the council does not primarily base their arguments on what the apostles practiced, but rather they make these additional theological arguments to support their case, this is not what we'd expect if they claim the practice went back to the apostles. This is why he claims that development is implied. 5. Suan claims it is the theology of the apostles that is the focus of the council, not their particular practices. So let's look at claim number 1. Nicea II more generally is not claiming that icon veneration goes back to the apostles. But here's Richard Price from the book. Quote, "A modern apologist for the veneration of images would readily concede that the practice took time to develop. But ever since the anti-Gnostic polemic of the 2nd and 3rd centuries in Irenaeus and Tertullian, it was axiomatic to claim that the Church's doctrine was simply the original preaching of Christ and the apostles, and that heresies damned themselves by being post-apostolic developments. The acts apply to the history of Christian doctrine, the Pentateuch's prohibition of adding or taking away anything from the original deposit." End quote. Notice there are several reasons Price lays out for thinking the council is claiming the practice goes back to the apostles. Also notice how he contrasts what the council thought with what modern apologists believe about development. They are two different things according to Price. Interesting. So the first reason Price gives is historical. He says that since the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was simply axiomatic to claim that the church's doctrine was simply the original preaching of Christ and the apostles. So this seems to be a historical trend. Second, there is the application of Deuteronomy 12:32 by the council, which prohibits the adding or taking away of anything from the original deposit. The key word here being anything. This would reasonably include icon veneration itself. The implication is that this is not something being added. Now here's more from Price. Quote, and in fact, a claim that the iconophile tradition went back to the apostles themselves becomes explicit in documents issued at the close of the council, as in the conciliar letter to the emperors. Quote, we have expressed and proclaimed the truth in unison, that in all respects, sacred images of our Lord Jesus Christ are to be fully accepted, and of all the saints, both on panels and on walls, on sacred vessels and vestments, as from the beginning of God's holy Catholic Church inherited, and as was laid down in law by the holy originators of our teaching and their successors, our inspired fathers. Or take the conciliar letter to the clergy of Constantinople. Accordingly, we follow the tradition of the Catholic Church. We made no deletions nor additions, but in the words of the apostle, we were taught and hold on to the traditions that we received, accepting and embracing everything that the Holy Catholic Church has handed from the beginning, both by word of mouth and in writing. This includes representations in painted images. End quote. Notice how Price appeals here not to the sessions or the decree of the council, but to the other conciliar letters issued at the close. This is important because Suan seems to suggest throughout his video that only that which can be found in the sessions and the decree counts as evidence for thinking the practice goes back to the apostles. But this is simply not true. Not only is there evidence in the sessions and the decree, which I'll get into shortly, but even if there weren't, this would not mean there is no evidence anywhere for what the council thought regarding the apostles. As we can see, Price certainly doesn't seem to agree with that. Now here's more from Price. Quote, if the iconophile position depended on a claim that the images of Christ and the saints went back to the apostles, the iconoclast position similarly depended on a claim that such images had no place in apostolic Christianity and were a later corruption. End quote. So here Price lays out another reason for thinking the council held that the practice went back to the apostles. It's what I call the symmetry argument. Both the iconoclasts and the iconophiles were making claims about what went back to the apostles. Thus, one claim implies the other. So it seems that according to Price, the council indeed was claiming the practice went back to the apostles. So what about number two? Suan's claim that the session of the council do not make explicit mention of the apostles engaging in 8th century style icon veneration. Here is the qualification that I mentioned earlier. At the end of the day, Suan does grant that the council makes the claim that icon veneration goes back to the apostles. He just qualifies this by saying that the word veneration is left open. It's ambiguous, and it can refer to many things, not necessarily 8th century style veneration specifically. As to Suan's claim that the sessions of the council do not mention this, here's Price again. Quote, the purpose of the long florilegium that fills session 4 was to prove that the church had images and paid them reverence from the beginning of its history. It followed that iconoclasm had no genuine roots within Christianity, but was an alien importation from heresy or alien religions, as a long sequence of citations in session 5 attempts to demonstrate. On the basis of these florilegia, the council felt able to claim that it has been proved that the custom of sacred images had been handed down from of old, and that we have come to know that the setting up of sacred images is an ancient tradition. The claim made here is, admittedly, ill-defined in chronological terms, but it is manifest that this ancient tradition included the golden age of the church fathers, and there was no sense in the 8th century that the faith and practice of the church had changed or significantly developed between apostolic and patristic times, end quote. So according to Price, not only does session 4 argue that the practice goes back to the apostles, but indeed this is what its purpose was. Notice also that Price says that the church had images and paid them reverence. According to Price, it wasn't simply the claim that the church had images. It was also that they paid them reverence. This was what was being claimed by the council as going back to the apostles. This is important because Suan claims that the council is only saying that it was the use of art that goes back to the beginning. Price simply disagrees. Now, what about what Suan claims about the word veneration? He says this is left open and does not necessarily refer to 8th century style veneration as something going back to the apostles. Now, here is where Suan says something really interesting. He mentions that in session 2, there is in fact a text that makes an explicit claim about icon veneration going back to the apostles, but then he dismisses it because it is a spurious text. It's a fake. But I'd want to ask, how is that relevant? What we're trying to determine is what the council believed about the apostles. Did they hold that this practice went back to the apostles or not? If they're including a spurious text to support the claim that icon veneration went back to the apostles, then that counts as evidence. For if they believe the contents of the text, then it doesn't matter if it's spurious. Here is a relevant line in the text claimed to be written by Basil. Quote, "I therefore also honor and venerate the figures of their images, especially because this was handed down from the holy apostles and was not forbidden by them, but these are portrayed in all our churches." End quote. Now, Suan seems to preempt this by saying veneration is too broad here to be referring to 8th century style veneration as something going back to the apostles. But I noticed in the footnotes of this passage a statement that this text can be dated no earlier than the iconoclast controversy. And guess what century the iconoclast controversy occurred in? The 8th century. So contra Suan, we do have good evidence that the type of veneration the authors most likely have in mind here is 8th century style veneration, all of which is being claimed goes back to the apostles. Here's what the footnote says. So far from there being no evidence in the sessions that the practice went back to the apostles, we have both session 2 and 4 offering solid evidence that it did. So what about point number 3? Suan's claim that the decree of the council does not explicitly say that the apostles venerated icons. So Suan is basically pointing out an interpretive stalemate here. He says that Gavin cannot simply appeal to the language of the decree, even if it looks like it is saying the practice goes back to the apostles, since the language is precisely what is in question. He says this is similar to what Protestants do when it comes to John 6, when Catholics claim that, well, it just looks like Jesus is saying, "This is my body." Well, Protestants dispute that reading. And so Suan is doing the same thing here with regard to the decree. He is disputing Gavin's reading. To save time, all I'm going to say about this point is that so far, I think we have brought forth good evidence from Price that tips the interpretive weight towards Gavin's side, such that it makes his interpretation more likely than Suan's. This is not simply a just read what the decree says argument. We've brought forth good evidence to support our reading. And I would recommend seeing also Gavin's recent response where he presents some additional problems with Suan's reading. I think he makes some good points there. All right, to point 4. Suan says that because the council makes additional theological arguments to support their case, rather than just appealing to the apostles, this is not what we'd expect if they were trying to argue that the practice went back to the apostles. This particular argument doesn't strike me as all that strong. First, it is acknowledged by Price that the council is largely an apologetic enterprise. They are mustering as many arguments as they can to support their desired outcome, which is to defend icon veneration. He also says that the reason they don't spend much time on apostolic evidence is because there really isn't any to appeal to. So this would explain why they spend more time on additional arguments to make their case. There just isn't much evidence from the apostolic era to draw from to begin with. And second, notice that there's nothing inconsistent by doing this. The point Gavin is making is that the council claims that the practice goes back to the apostles. He's not claiming that's the only thing they say, or that's the only way they present their case. It's perfectly consistent for the council to do both. The council can make the claim that the practice goes back to the apostles, and they can also present additional arguments. So I don't see how this argument is particularly strong. So let's go to point 5, where Suan claims it is the theology of the apostles that is the focus of the council, not their particular practice. Here also is another way that Suan qualifies things. Because again, he ultimately does affirm that the council is claiming that icon veneration goes back to the apostles. He just qualifies what veneration means, which we just addressed earlier. But he also qualifies what in particular goes back to the apostles. This is the part in his video where he disputes this in the line, "This is the faith of the apostles." He qualifies that this only refers to the theology of the apostles, so as to leave room for development. Basically, he claims the council is arguing for something more modest. They are not claiming the 8th century practice goes back to the apostles, but rather only that the theology that gives rise to the 8th century practice, that is what goes back to the apostles. Thus, his claim entails that the council has a modern development view in mind when they issued the decrees. But as we've already argued, there's good evidence to think that the council does in fact have 8th century icon veneration in mind as going back to the apostles. As for how likely it is that the council has Suan's modern notion of development in mind, here's Richard Price and Roman Catholic apologist Eric Ybarra.
We've come across a lot of questions over the years as to what the evidence is of the fathers of the church doing these things, venerating images of Christ and the saints, and I think that we are left really to trust whether the Golden Age fathers and the fathers thereafter were truly representative of the of the apostolic tradition, because otherwise there doesn't seem to be a lot of documentary evidence that the apostles and their immediate successors did this.
I think the answer is that we have to accept a view of development in the church, in doctrine, in devotions, in external practices. And the task of the historian of doctrine is to show that this development was a true development and not just a falling away from the authentic apostolic message. The fathers didn't have that sense of a development of tradition, but that is the way in which we need to make sense of these developments. The fathers didn't have that sense of a development of tradition, but that is the way in which we need to make sense of these developments in the church.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, and I'll make one more point here. I'm going to pass it over to William. But I think you hit on the nail there because, St. John Henry Newman is famous for his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. I'm willing to admit that the fathers really didn't have that hermeneutical lens. They thought that what the apostles taught is what Chalcedon taught, is what Nicea taught. But it's very apparent that there is a process of unfolding, correcting, editing, revising that goes on. And so I think that takes place from every angle. And I think that the doctrine of the veneration of images is definitely a legitimate development, but it is a development nonetheless.
So I think in conclusion, the overall evidential weight supports Gavin's view, namely that it is more likely that the council held that icon veneration goes back to the apostles, rather than to holding something like Suan's development view. And as has been pointed out by Suan, if this is the case, then this would adversely affect his position, such that he would have to revise it. A final note. I asked Suan on his recent live stream what it would mean for his view if Gavin were right. And he basically said that since the Roman Catholic takes the council as infallible, they would be forced to just take the council's word on icon veneration being something the apostles practiced in spite of the evidence. All I will say to that is that if one is just pre-committed to Roman Catholicism, no matter what the evidence says, then this will probably be the only option they can take. However, for those on the fence, this may not be a plausible route. And for people like that, I would suggest they look more into Protestantism as a viable option. I hope this video serves you.